You start out your book by saying, and I quote, "This book is about the American failure to secure the region after 9/11 and to carry out nation building on a scale that could have reversed the appeal of terrorism and Islamic extremism and averted state collapse. Compared with what is at stake in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Iraq may turn out to be a mere sideshow, a historical folly that diverted global attention for some years, but had little impact in changing the real nature of power and politics in the Middle East. The US failure to secure Central Asia may well lead to global terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and a drug epidemic on a scale that we have not yet experienced, and I can only hope we never will." Well, that's a nice, cheery beginning. So, let me put it to you. Let's start by going through this in order. What did the United States do after 9/11? And then we'll go through what it should have done, where we are now, and what should be done next. So what did we do? The book is a discussion of our failed policies. What exactly were those policies and why did they fail?
Well, I mean, I think in one word, Iraq. Because within weeks of the war in Afghanistan, the US was preparing to invade Iraq. And in fact, most of even the very few resources that the US had deployed in Afghanistan were all redeployed for retraining for Iraq. And what we saw then was that basically Afghanistan was put on hold, and that meant that deployment of peacekeeping troops, deployment of NATO, reconstruction, money for rebuilding the country, for rebuilding the infrastructure, and a regional solution so that the neighboring countries would not start once again getting involved in Afghanistan. All that was put on hold. And instead what we saw was that the warlords were empowered because there was no central government and the Americans were not willing to deploy troops to keep the peace. So the warlords, the hated warlords who Afghans had literally thrown out of the country, were, here were the liberators of Afghanistan, welcomed by the Afghan people. For the first time, foreign troops, I think, were welcomed by almost 90% of the population. And yet, here were the American liberators bringing back, within 3 months, the very same people who the Afghan people had rejected, in the 1990s. And I think that was a critical mistake because the warlords prevented the central government from really having any outreach. And the warlords prevented the central government from building up capacity. Because the Americans were basically, they weren't supporting both. They were giving lip service to Karzai and the central government. But the essential power in the provinces was controlled by the warlords. And this policy really went on for about 3 years, until the 2004 elections. I think the other very misguided policy was the singular focus on Al-Qaeda. The US military was really programmed for the first 4 years to go after Al-Qaeda. And the Taliban were ignored. Despite warnings by all sorts of people like President Karzai and people in Pakistan and others, the Taliban essentially retreated into Pakistan. And there was no American interest in either talking to the Taliban or negotiating with them or crushing them or capturing them. And the Pakistanis were not interested in doing that either for a variety of reasons. So the Taliban were really left free and easy to regroup and to restart their offensive, which they did in 2003, 2004. So I think these were, really the critical mistakes.
Now you say the policy changed after 2004.
Well, policy changed for a very mundane political reason. The Bush wanted to get re-elected in 2004, and in the summer of 2004, there was what you would call now a surge in money and in reconstruction efforts. The first major roads were completed in that year. And President Bush wanted to point to the American people, given that you were now in the midst of the insurgency in Iraq, and Iraq was not going well. He wanted to point to Afghanistan as a success story. And so we did see a surge in troops, in money, in reconstruction, and for the first time, Rumsfeld actually allows, because, he had blocked NATO troops from deploying in Afghanistan back in 2002. He allows, other Western troops to come in a peacekeeping role. But the very next year, 2005, 2006, the insurgency really takes off. And in fact, that window of opportunity between 2001 and 2004, in my opinion, was the lost window. Because that was the time when you had the government of Karzai was popular. It had credibility. The Americans were popular. They had credibility. The Western forces were all, the Afghans were waiting for the West to rebuild the country. And in that window of opportunity, almost very little was done. And by the time the Americans come around to actually rebuilding the Afghan army, putting money into the police, building the justice sector, doing economics, etc., the insurgency had started. And disillusionment with Karzai and with the Americans had also started.